Hey everyone. So in my last couple of videos, I've been talking about a couple speeches that Martin Luther King Jr. gave called The Other America and Loving Your Enemies. And in these speeches, he gives a lot of resources that he found within Christianity that enabled him to encounter a lot of the adversity and the racism happening during his age without becoming a hateful, intolerant, and even apathetic person in light of what was going on. And in this video, I'm going to seek to answer the question that he was asking throughout those speeches. And that is, how do you change the heart of the individual racist? So he did believe that you could fight and even defeat systematic racism utilizing legislation. And he even believed that by doing so, you can shift the culture and therefore shift the majority view of what we consider racism and what we consider equality. But what he never believed was that by doing so, you can get rid of individual racism. And one of the issues that we're having in our culture right now is that we don't understand fully the differences and the distinctions between individual racism and systematic racism. We believe that since individual racism exists, therefore systematic racism exists, and that's not the case. And Martin Luther King Jr. didn't believe that way either. So as bad and as negative as systematic racism is, you can't get rid of it with legislation. In fact, the individual racist will become even more hardened in their belief systems the more legislation you throw at them. You need something outside of the country, outside of the culture, to reach that person's heart. And Martin Luther King Jr. believed that this thing existed, and that's why he never gave up on the racist. He never moved to the place where he just hated them and asked for their death. He always believed that they could be reached. So what was the resource that he had that enabled him to believe this way? Well, as you go through the Bible, you see many instances of racism being resolved. And my favorite one is actually found in Ephesians 2. So as we go through this chapter, I'm hoping that you guys will get a better understanding of what this resource was for Martin Luther King and how we can look at our culture and society and look at racism even in our own hearts and see how it could be cured through the gospel and through God. So in Ephesians 2, verse 14, Paul is saying this: "For he, Jesus, himself is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity," or the hostility, "that is in the law and the commandments, contained within the ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace, and that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. And he came and preached peace to those who are far off and to those who are near. For through him we both have access by one Spirit to the Father." Now, when Paul wrote this, he was dealing with an issue of racism that was existing in the early church between the Jews and the Gentiles. And when he's looking at what the source of this racism was, he looks at the law. And you can see that in verse 14 when he says that Jesus sought to abolish the enmity or the hostility that existed because of the law and the ordinances. So what's he talking about? Well, for most of us in the modern day, when we hear the word law in context of the Bible, we tend to think of the Ten Commandments. And the law does include those, but that's not what the law is. The law, or the Torah for the Jew, referred to either, depending on how you take this definition, either the first 5 books of the Bible or the entirety of the Old Testament. And what's contained in those books is contained the culture, the history, and the religious beliefs of the Israelite people. So what Paul's saying, in other words, is that the culture of the Jews, because it was so different than the Gentiles, there was a hostility between the two, and even a belief in the Jews that the Gentiles were inferior to them innately because of those differences. So let me give you an example from my own life to help you maybe understand this a little bit better. When I was 19 years old, I went over to Afghanistan for the first time, and I encountered a culture that was different than any I had ever seen. Right? There are definitely cultural distinctions within America. But the difference that I saw in Afghanistan was mind-blowing. It was completely different than anything I had ever experienced here. The way that they ate, the way that they slept, the way that they worked, the way that they raised their kids, the way that they married, everything was wildly different from the way that we do things here. And when me and my friends went over there, it was almost impossible for us not to start making judgments of how these people were living. We saw the way they treated women. We saw that, man, like women weren't given rights over there. Women were married off at usually the ages of like 13, 14, or even younger in some cases. We saw how women weren't allowed to be educated. We saw how they raised their children, sometimes beating them, and they didn't see that as being weird. We saw sexual practices over there that were just completely off the wall, like things that you would be shocked if I went into detail about the things that we saw over there regarding their sexuality and things like that. And when we looked at these differences, when we looked at these distinctions between our culture and theirs, what we started to do slowly and subtly is we started to, instead of judging the culture, we started to judge the people. In other words, instead of looking at their society and saying, there's some differences in our societies, we started saying there's some differences in them versus us. And we started to really believe that there was an inherent inferiority within their race that made them act differently than us. And the way that we worded it was we would say things like, if I lived in this society, I wouldn't be acting like this. I wouldn't treat women that way, right? I would stand up to the Taliban. I wouldn't let them oppress me and my family. I wouldn't be hating people the way that they are. I wouldn't be treating justice this way, right? And what we're saying is we're saying that we're so superior to them that even if we grew up in their culture, we wouldn't turn out the way that they did. That there's something wrong with them. And even if you change the culture, you can't change the person. So that's what we really genuinely believed. And that's what's been happening throughout history. People from one culture encounter a different culture and they start making judgments. They start saying we're different. And the reason that we're different is because there's something inherently inferior about you. So when the Europeans met the Africans, that's what they did. When the Africans met the Europeans, that's what they did. And even within the same culture, within the same ethnicity, that stuff happened. When different Europeans met each other, that's what they did. When different African tribes met each other, that's what they did. When different American Indian tribes met each other, that's what they did. That's what's inherent in humanity. When we meet different cultures, when we see things done differently, instead of saying that they're different, we see them as right versus wrong. And that makes us become intolerant to the people that we're looking at. So when Paul is saying that this is what's going on in the early church, he said it's the culture that's to blame for this. That's what's causing the enmity. That's what's causing the hostility. And if you don't understand that that's where it comes from, you'll never understand how to fix racism. And in fact, we start getting this false belief that we've moved past it and none of us are racist anymore. Yes, we are. We just don't realize that we are. And let me just give you an example, a modern day example that's very, very widespread without our society. How many people in our culture and society really believe that if they lived during the time of slavery, during the time of systemic racism and oppression, they would be the same as the rest of the culture? How many people in our culture society really believe that? And the answer is not many. All of us are like, if I lived during that time, or if I was around those people, I would have never done that. And even the oppressed people can think that way too, right? The people who have been oppressed, the minority groups that have been oppressed in America, could look back at the way that the white people treated them and say, man, if we were in charge, if we were in power, we would have never treated people that way. That's disgusting, right? When you say things like that, you're making a judgment. You're saying that there is something inherently inferior about those people, and that's why they're acting the way that they are. You don't see yourself on the same level as them. You don't see it as a cultural difference. You see it as a racist difference. There's an ethnic difference. There's a DNA difference. And that can never be overcome, which is why you are seeing a wave of racism in our culture today. And that racism is happening between people who see themselves as being oppressed, because they have been. Their ancestors have been oppressed in this nation, towards the people that they see as their oppressors. That's what's going on right now. But that is a form of racism. That's a form of intolerance. And Paul is saying whenever we make these cultural distinctions and whenever we blame it on the case of an inherent difference of inferiority versus superiority, we are becoming bigotous ourselves. We are becoming racist. And he also points out another problem. Because in our culture today, one of the things that we might say is okay, well, if that's where it comes from, then it's wrong to judge anyone else's culture. But if you say that, you're really shooting yourself in the foot. I mean, think about this for a second. Are you really going to look at the culture of Afghanistan and see the way they treat women and say, well, it's just different? Who am I to say what's better or worse? Is it really better to not beat your wife? Is it really better not to educate women or to give them rights? Right? You can't say that. Obviously, you have to look at that and say that's wrong. If you don't say it that way, then you have to say that, yeah, it's all relative, and if that was happening in our country, I wouldn't be offended by it. Right? But if you're a thinking person, you'd say, no, I'd be offended by that because that's wrong behavior. But when you make a judgment call like that, like I said, what's implicit in that statement is that there's something wrong with the people doing it, and that's why they're committing these actions. So how can you judge a culture without becoming arrogant, puffed up, and intolerant towards the people who abide in that culture? And this is what Paul's getting at when he talks about God saving both those who are near and those who are far. Notice that's a judgment call. He's saying that the Jews were nearer to God than the Gentiles. In other words, we were better, right? Where did our culture come from? It came from God. Where did the Gentile culture come from? The culture of my ancestors? It didn't come from God. It came from our thoughts and ideas of what was best. And because of that, there were some good laws and commandments that existed in the laws of my ancestors, and there was a lot of bad ones. And the same is true for all of us. The distinction that Paul makes is that even though the Jews were nearer, they still weren't there. There was still a massive chasm between them and God. And that he realized that since the Jew, given all the opportunities that the Jew had to be able to be someone near to God, the fact that they failed proved that the Jew was not superior to the Gentile. They just had a cultural difference that enabled them to act differently. Paul was familiar with the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God says over and over again that he did not choose the Israelites because they were better than anyone else. He chose them because he chose them. It was grace. And in fact, God gave the law to them, again, not because he believed they could follow it, but he gave the law to them as a gracious act, even though he knew that they wouldn't. And if you read through the Old Testament, you realize that they did not follow the laws. They did not follow the cultural distinctions that God gave to them. And that's why they constantly went into exile. God essentially said to them, if you don't want to live in the culture that I've given you, I'll send you to a different culture, right? You can go live like everybody else. And that's what constantly happened to them. So Paul looks at all this and he says, the Jews weren't better. We had a better culture, but that's not because of something that we did. That's something that God did for us. And if even with all those advantages, we still couldn't reach God, how could we possibly say that we're better than anyone else, right? And then he looked up and he said, there's only one superior race in all the cosmos, and that is the race of God versus the race of man. And because of our differences, it would be very easy for God to look at the injustice and the issues within our world and say, you know what? You guys are inferior to me, and I don't want to have anything to do with you. God would have been fully within his rights to do that. But what did he do instead? Paul says that in his flesh, in the tearing of his flesh, he has made the two one. With who? One with him. God loved us so much, in spite of our cultural differences, that he actually became one of us, lived underneath the oppressive and the flawed systems that we ourselves live under, and even allowed himself to be killed by those unjust systems in one of the most unfair and one of the most blasphemous ways that anyone has ever died in the entirety of the human race. And God did all of that because he cared for us. What does that enable us to do? It enables us to come into the community of God, to the culture of God, and understand him. And when we're there, we realize that the culture of God judges my culture just as harshly as it judges anyone else. So yes, I can look at the Afghani culture and say the way they treat women is wrong, the way that they raise children in a lot of aspects is wrong. However, the Afghani culture can look at ours, and by the same standard, by the standard of God, they can condemn us. They can condemn some of the licentiousness of how we live. They'd be like, man, you guys say that you respect women. Look at the way that you treat them. Look at the way that you objectify them, and you treat them in your media, and you treat them in pornography. Like, what do you mean that we mistreat women? You guys mistreat women. And they could judge us by the same standard, meaning that the standard of God, as Hebrews 4 puts it, is a two-edged sword. And whenever you wield it against someone else, it is wielded against you just as harshly, which brings us all to our desperate need for grace. This is what changed Paul. Because you remember, Paul wasn't exactly a tolerant person before he came to Christ. Paul was a very intolerant person, to such an extent that when Christianity began, he wanted to stamp them out. He persecuted and sought to kill the Christians. This was not exactly a guy that you would call tolerant and accepting by our standards. This was an incredibly bigotous man, and yet he went from being a bigotous man to being the man that brought the gospel to the Gentiles and was one of the most loving men in all of human history. What enabled him to do that? What changed his heart? It wasn't simply him saying racism is wrong, I'm not going to do it anymore. It was instead him recognizing his state before God, him, in other words, becoming humbled by the love and the affection and, yes, the justice of God that was rightly due to him. And as he became humbled, his view of himself did not become inferior, but instead he saw himself as being another human being on level with everybody else, in desperate need of the grace and love of God. And when he understood that, the racism in him melted away. And he became loving and he became caring to those around him. And the more we understand that, and the more the gospel humbles us, the more we're going to be able to look at others without racism, without intolerance, but with love, care, and understanding. And that is a resource that even Martin Luther King Jr. had to abide in. The reason why he wasn't intolerant towards the white people, even though Malcolm X and many people around him were, they looked at the white people and said, we would never do that. We would never enslave another race. We would never treat people like you did. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't think that way. He thought in the right circumstances, in the right situations, my people could have done the exact same thing. And the only distinction between me and everybody else is not my righteousness, but Christ's righteousness that I have received by grace through faith. That's what cures racism in the human heart. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Again, it's a controversial topic, so if you have any questions about it, please leave them in the comments, and I look forward to talking to you guys again soon. Thank you.